Good evening, virtual audience, and welcome. Thank you for tuning in tonight. My name is Kate Bruns, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so delighted to introduce this event with Roman KRZNARIC and David Farrier, discussing their latest books, The Good Ancestor, A Radical Prescription for Long-Term Thinking, and Footprints in Search of Future Fossils. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these unprecedented times. We host virtual events like tonight's 5 times a week. As always, you can find our event schedule on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our bookshelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, please submit it through the Q&A button, which you can locate at the bottom of your screen. We're going to get through as many as time allows for. In a couple of minutes, in the Zoom chat box, I will be sharing links to purchase tonight's featured books, The Good Ancestor and Footprints. If you would like to support our store in a different way, I will also be sharing a donation link for Harvard Bookstore. Thank you from the bottom of our book-selling hearts for your patronage during this difficult time. It makes this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever ensures the future of a landmark independent bookstore. And finally, as you might have experienced in virtual gatherings the last few weeks, technical issues can arise, and if they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly. So thank you for your patience and your understanding. And now I'm very excited to introduce tonight's speakers. Public philosopher Roman KRZNARIC has influenced political and ecological campaigners, education reformers, social entrepreneurs, and designers with his incisive works and ideas. The author of 7 books, including Empathy, The Wonder Box, and Carpe Diem Regained, Roman is currently a research fellow of the Long Now Foundation. He's also a founding faculty member of the School of Life and founder of the world's first Empathy Museum. Joining him tonight is Professor of Literature and the Environment at the University of Edinburgh, David Farrier. An award-winning writer, his 2019 book, Anthropocene Poetics, Deep Time, Sacrifice Zones, and Extinction, is a study of contemporary environmental poetry. His ongoing research and his writings look at literary responses to environmental change and to the Anthropocene. Tonight, they will be discussing Deep Time and the fascinating intersection of their 2 latest books, The Good Ancestor and Footprints. Both texts have been hailed for their clarity, insight, inspiration, and grace. As artist Katie Patterson writes, expanding our time horizons to envisage a longer now is the most imperative journey any of us can make. So it seems we have all come to the right place tonight. It's a tremendous joy to host this event. So without further ado, the digital podium is yours, Roman and David.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Kate. I'm going to give a little 5-minute introduction to The Good Ancestor, then David will follow and we'll have a bit of a conversation between us before we go to the Q&A. And the book I've written, The Good Ancestor, I hope is the opposite of the breathless short-termism of the election that you're all involved in the US, because David and I are in the UK and Scotland in his case. And my book, in a way, is designed as an antidote to those short-term political cycles, an antidote to the myopic 24/7 media that dominates our lives, the short-termism of nations that sit around international conference tables bickering away while the planet burns and species disappear, and the short-termism of markets that spike then crash in speculative bubbles, and that also is part of our everyday lives, us constantly checking our text, clicking the buy now button, because in a way we do live in the age of the tyranny of the now. And we know that we need more long-term thinking to prepare ourselves for the next pandemic on the horizon, to get ready for technological risks that might be coming our way, for example, from AI-controlled lethal autonomous weapons. We need to think long-term to confront the racial injustice that gets passed on from generation to generation, embedded in criminal justice systems and everyday culture. And of course, we need long-term thinking to tackle the global ecological crisis, climate change, biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, and so on. And there's a kind of paradox here, isn't there, that the need for long-term thinking is incredibly urgent. And there's this kind of conceptual emergency around it, I think, that people say, we need more long-term thinking, there's too much short-termism, but what is long-term thinking really about? Is it always good for us? That's something I've tried to explore. And one of the central metaphors of this book, The Good Ancestor, is the idea that we have colonized the future, that we treat it like a distant colonial outpost where we can freely dump ecological degradation and technological risk as if there was nobody there. And the tragedy, of course, is that future generations aren't here to challenge this pillaging of their inheritance. Now, it can be quite difficult to get our heads around the extent of this injustice, the way that future generations are left out of our political systems. They have no voice in the marketplace. So let me just show you an image which tries to picture it for us, the scale of unborn generations. There in the little green circle are the living, the 7.7 billion of us alive today. But over the past 50,000 years, an estimated 100 billion people have been born and died. But both of these are far outweighed by the nearly 7 trillion people who will be born over the next 50,000 years, assuming current birth rates stabilize. So there in the orange circle are all your grandchildren and their grandchildren and the friends and communities on whom they'll depend. So the real question is, how are they going to judge us for what we did or didn't do when we had the chance? And this was a question asked by the great immunologist Jonas Salk, who said the great question about time is, are we being good ancestors? And I've stolen that phrase of his for the title of my book and tried to explore, well, what does it really mean to be a good ancestor? And what are the different ways we might extend our time horizons, as Salk advised? So we think not on a scale of seconds, minutes, and hours, but a scale of decades, centuries, and millennia. And at the center of the book is a kind of a diagram that you can see there called the tug of war for time. On the one side are 6 drivers of short-term thinking, and they're matched on the other side by 6 ways to think long-term, from thinking about deep time humility to the idea of cathedral thinking and having transcendent goals to guide our whole civilization. And what the book does really is explore those ideas, but then opens out to saying, well, how do we put long-term thinking into practice? And there it's a celebration of what I think of as time rebels. These are people who are dedicated to long-term thinking and intergenerational justice, from people leading political movements to give rights to future generations, to sci-fi authors who are trying to change the cultural conversation about long-termism, to economic radicals who are campaigning for Green New Deals and regenerative economies. And I've tried to bring all of their voices together to really give a sense that there is a time rebellion happening right now. Even though we might feel we are caught in all those short-term cycles, we have an opportunity to stretch our imaginations forward in time, get out of these short-term cycles and reconnect with the long and life-giving ecological choreography of the planet. And that is my little introduction to the book. And now I'd like to hand over to David.
Great, thank you, Roman. And it is a fantastic book, which I encourage you all to buy. I think it's a book that asks the essential question of our times: how do we become good ancestors? And it was a similar question that motivated me in writing Footprints. In my case, it was, how will we be remembered? Where we filled the world with made things. We are creating so many changes to the planet, from the outline of our coastlines, the rising seas, to the many long-lived materials, concrete and plastic, that are filling every ecosystem on the planet. These material legacies will linger time out of mind in many cases. And my question was, what stories will they tell about us? What will they say about who we were, how we lived, what we valued? And so what I'd like to do to introduce Footprints to you is read a short passage from a chapter where I go to the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, where I live, to look at their collection of Stone Age hand axes. "This is the oldest hand axe in the collection," Alison said, "probably about 200,000 years old." She handed it to me as carefully as if it had been made of glass. It was about the size of a flattened avocado, off-white in colour with a dark halo around the edges, and much rougher than the younger pieces we'd been looking at. The marks left from knapping the stone were still clear, each one like a ripple in water. Under Alison's watchful eye, I picked up the axe and hefted it in my right hand. It felt unexpectedly unwieldy, no more than a lump of stone. But when I transferred it to my left, the awkwardness immediately fell away. A gentle depression had been worn exactly where my thumb was pressed. My fingers nestled comfortably in shallow grooves on the back. Suddenly the object was familiar and easy. It almost asked me to strike something with it. It sat as neatly in my hand as the Bronze Age axes had fitted in their foam beds, as if the hand that once held it now held mine. The connection was startling, so much so that I quickly put it down again. Could this have been made specifically for someone left-handed? I asked. It's possible, Alison replied. Stone tools like this are the oldest technology on Earth, having first been manufactured around 2 million years ago. For most of human history, these raw implements were our sole venture into a world that we could shape and hone ourselves. Every invention that we take for granted follows from that first rock that became a tool, that leap toward a more plastic world. This heritage of insights, of rough edges honed and new possibilities imagined, remains in everything we make today. The ghost and the machine, born through their long stories. The philosopher Bruno Latour says that all made things are composites of actions and decisions that reach back into deep time. Most of these entities now sit in silence, he writes, as if they did not exist, invisible, transparent, mute, bringing to the present scene their force and their action from who knows how many millions of years past. In handling the stone, I had brushed against the margins of its immense biography, but this was true too of the other made objects around us, the plastic bubble wrap, the foam padding. Each one emerged out of a welter of past actions and had the potential to endure far into the future. I wondered how we also write ourselves into them, and how they in turn write us into the world they pass through. Would someone in the far future pick up a piece of 21st century plastic, something molded to fit anonymously into the user's hand like a bottle or a toothbrush, and feel, as I had done, that same jolt of connection? So, thinking, I guess, in terms of deep time that takes us to both the very deep past and the very deep future. Roman, we're thinking about the, what, not just how to be good ancestors, how to rethink our relationship with deep time and with the deep future, but also, and you began talking about this, what prevents us from being good ancestors. So I wonder if I could ask you to get us started, to say a little bit more about why it is that we find it so difficult to be good ancestors.
I was actually going to ask you the same question, so that's a bit unfair, but well, I think when we're trying to think about what is it that prevents us thinking over those long time horizons, connecting with deep time, our instinctive answer is to go for the everyday object, say, well, it's all about my phone. You know, it's all about this technology, which is making me click and buy now. It's all about those businesses that can't see beyond the quarterly report. It's all about those politicians who are just worried about their own careers and don't want to think for the long term. But actually, I think the roots of our short-term afflictions are much deeper than that. They at least go back to the medieval period with the rise of the first mechanical clocks in Europe in the 14th century, when we started measuring time, when we started consuming it, when it started speeding up, we started bringing the future forward. You know, by 1700, most clocks had minute hands. By 1800, they had second hands. And then the clock became the key machine of the Industrial Revolution, keeping those assembly lines moving faster and faster and faster, as we found in Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times. And now we've moved on to the nanosecond and millisecond speed share trade. So there's this long history of the clock that we often don't think about. We don't remember that the way we approach time is really a social invention in many ways. You know, that we have learned this approach to time, and we can potentially unlearn it, which allows me to then flip the question back to you, really, which is, when I was writing my book, trying to think a lot about deep time, I was really struggling. It doesn't come naturally to me. I once had a conversation with the cosmologist Martin Rees, the British Astronomer Royal. That's a guy, he just thinks in terms of billions of years backwards and forwards, right? Not me. I look at a geological table of the Jurassic and Cretaceous. I don't feel anything. So I'm wondering what you've learned in your book, which is full of literary travels, but also physical travels around the landscape. What have you learned about the best ways to connect us with the billions upon billions of years of time in which we are just a moment in the cosmic story?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? That the one aspect of the climate crisis and the many different kinds of crises that we face is a crisis of the imagination, the difficulty of really grasping the scale of deep time, and the kind of legacies that we're talking about. And for me, it comes down to thinking about stories. I think, to perhaps not just rest on the numbers, but to think about our connection to these seemingly very distant times, distant generations, in terms of the stories that we're telling them right now. You mentioned, when thinking about the presentism, the short-termism, you said it's all about our phone. Well, it could, in terms of thinking in deep time terms, you could think it's all about my phone as well. This is an object whose various components, are likely to linger, long after I've gone. But even the possibility is perhaps remote that my particular phone will be one to leave a fossil, but there are also many of these objects now, around the planet, and as there are of many different kinds of made things, that something is likely to leave some kind of impression, and to think about that object, that everyday object that I handle, that I touch every day, as part of a story that I am telling, that I am part of telling to the future, is for me has been what's brought that sense of the deep future right up close. It's given me that sense of the intimacy of our relationship with 10,000 years from now, 10 million years from now, even. So it's about storytelling, I think.
It's interesting, actually, because when you were talking about the stone axe, and I remember reading that passage in your book, one of the things that it really touched in me was something. At the same time, I was doing all this reading about the development of stone tool technology, discovering something I didn't know, which was that, and maybe you knew this, but I certainly didn't know it, that over 2 million years, if you track the development of this increasing sophistication of stone tools, they tell us something about our capacity to think long term. So, the first stone tools were, basically just something with a sharp edge or a sharp point. But gradually, we learned to flake off a bit of stone by hitting it against another stone. And then we learned to make tools which had multiple planes which met in a point. And then there are all these sort of complex techniques for making stone tools. And in order to do that, and there's a great anthropologist and archaeologist called Sander van der Leuwe, who writes about this. I think it's at the University of Arizona. He says, well, we could only make those sophisticated stone tools if we were able to plan sequences of action, or if we hadn't had something, a goal to aim at, we could work backwards how to get there, kind of reverse causation. So I suddenly, when I started going into the museums where I live, I live in Oxford in the UK, and there's the Natural History Museum. I had walked past those stone tools for years, never looking at them. Suddenly I saw the history of human civilization in them, because if we were able to plan forward how to make a stone tool, well, as van der Leuwe says, he says, well, that's the same kind of mental leap we need to plan crop rotation or building a pyramid. It's separating out sequences of action. So we actually have within us, deep in our evolutionary history, a capacity to think long term. And there it is, you're holding it in your hand, in a way. So that's another story about ourselves, another narrative, that we are not just short-term creatures. We also have this sort of long-term capacity in our brains. What do you think about that?
Definitely. I mean, I think what I was thinking about when you were talking there was that, what we have there in those stone tools as evidence of planning is also evidence of perhaps the first stories. I mean, in order to project into a, like you say, a long-term goal or a future goal, even if a fairly modest one, it is, you need something that can take you out of the here and now. I mean, you talked about the tyranny of the clock. Well, the tyranny of the here and now surely also bound our ancestors until they could, think ahead and also carry information from the past with them. And so I think, which is also evident in these kind of learned techniques. So these objects are themselves evidence of of storytelling that's been something that's so deeply rooted in us. And it's heartening, I think, as you say, that we have this capacity within us, that we bear it deep within our kind of cultural DNA. What it means to be human emerges out of that capacity to plan, to think, to take the future into account. And I mean, your book is absolutely full of brilliant examples of how this has happened in the past. I mean, it's almost unfair to ask you just to pick one, but I wonder if you could give us one example that you think is the best illustration of long-term thinking in action.
Okay, so the example that just popped into my mind somewhat randomly was the Victorian sewers built in London after the famous Great Stink of 1858. Up until that time, raw sewage was being dumped in the Thames. Tens of thousands of people were dying each year from cholera and diphtheria and other diseases. But after the long, hot summer of 1858, the stench was so bad it started wafting even into the Houses of Parliament, and members of Parliament had to walk around with masks over their faces like they should be doing now. They're probably not. Yeah. And they, in this moment of crisis, really, they passed the legislation for building the sewers. And over the next 19 years, 82 miles of sewers were built with 318 million bricks and 22,000 workers, masterminded by the Victorian engineer, Sir Joseph Bazalgette, who, thank God for his long-term thinking, built the sewers twice as big as they needed to be. And that's why they are still in use today. It was an extraordinary act of long-term thinking and kind of resilience, But I think it tells us something really interesting about, well, it's sometimes called, cathedral thinking, this idea of embarking on projects taking years and have long time horizons. And I believe humans actually are really good at this. Look over the last 5,000 years of history. And one of the places we see a lot of this long-term thinking and planning and strategizing and action is actually in cities. And there's a line in your book which really struck me. It was the line which sort of resonated with me most. And I'd love you just to unpack it for me. If you remember this line, you wrote, "All cities are incipient ruins." All right. Cities are incipient ruins. And I just felt that line contained so much, because even around it, you start talking about Venice and other cities, Calvino. So can you just tell us a little bit more about cities, actually?
Yeah, well, I guess that comes from the sense that, many cities around the world have a kind of palimpsestic quality, that they're written upon and then erased and written over, and they bear this trace of a kind of layered history. There's always that sense of the city's past. But also, our cities are perhaps our most concentrated, or will be our most concentrated source of future fossils. We can see such vast megacities now located on coastlines, in areas that are, in kind of geological terms, sinking, where seas are rising. And the blunt fact is that there are many cities around the world that face a very uncertain future. From Shanghai, that I visit in Footprints, to Miami, to Mumbai, and many others, and with the great possibility that there will be a kind of geological trace of these cities in millions of years to come, a kind of thin layer in the strata bearing residues of the various materials, the concrete, the glass, the steel, and perhaps even the precise impressions of particular objects. So one of the questions that really grasped my imagination was, how does a city become like a mega city like Shanghai, how does it become a fossil? And taking that perspective to stand in in the top of the Shanghai Tower, the second tallest building in the world, to look out at this immense, almost endless city, and think, well, what's the kind of geologic future of this, and what kind of stories might they be able to tell, as I've been saying, about how we lived, what we valued from that. Really, just spun my mind.
Well, it's funny actually, because often where people are looking at places like Shanghai or Miami and thinking, how do we stop these places becoming fossils? Because of course they are the ones that are going to be flooded first. They are the ones that are going to be subject to our colonial dumping of ecological degradation on the future.
Yeah, well, I think, and of course, we need to be thinking about how we create a livable future in places like this. But over the long term, all cities have reached their end. And even if we don't apply a kind of catastrophic narrative to, the future fate of a city like Shanghai or New York or something like that, ultimately these cities will find themselves, coming to the end of their lives. But they are so deeply embedded and so full of a concentration of synthetic materials, they are going to leave a trace.
It's interesting. As you were just talking there, I was thinking of Kim Stanley Robinson's book,
Yes.
New York 2140, and he certainly believes the cities are going to survive, but they are going to morph. They are going to be transformed. And interestingly, he talks about New York in 2140 as a super Venice. The waters go up 50 feet and, most of Manhattan's underwater. It's a city now of canals. And I think it's really interesting to think about. I mean, I'm a sci-fi addict, read a lot of science fiction books, helping me try and stretch my imagination. And one of the things I love about your book is just this enormous number of sort of literary references to things which are helping me sort of see the time dimensions of various writers, like Calvino or J.G. Ballard and many others. And as I was reading your book, another book came to mind. I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm throwing up all these other books, but look, here's another one, which I have my sci-fi shelf right next to me. And Olaf Stapleton's book, Star Maker, came to mind as I was reading your book. There's this part in Star Maker, you might know, where he's talking about an imaginary, another world, another planet called the Other Earth, which is a little bit like our Earth, but it's the Other Earth. And on the Other Earth, they have these archaeologists, and they go down into the rock strata, and they discover a lithographic plate that's 10 million years old. And on that plate, it has a diagram of a radio on it. Now, this book was written in the 1930s, and the radio was the most sophisticated technology they had. So these archaeologists discover this radio plan 10 million years old. And the archaeologists and everyone on the Other Earth cannot believe that it is possible that there was a civilization like their own that collapsed. They think it must have been put there by some visitors from outer space or something like that. They cannot believe that a society as sophisticated and that it's developed as their own could possibly die. So that's my question to you really is, do you think this civilization could really truly disappear in the same way as the Roman Empire or the Mayans? Is that what you actually fear? Is that why you really wrote this book?
No, I mean, I think we have to face up to the fact that this is an existential crisis for all of us. But the challenge is really about, how do we remake this civilization so that it is durable and sustainable, so that we can thrive. I mean, in a sense, yeah. I mean, the way we have lived up to date can't be sustained. It has to come to an end, but that doesn't mean that human society has to come to an end. We need to learn new ways of exchanging, new ways of governing, new ways of thinking and talking to one another. And so I feel that there has to be cause for hope. And we kind of trading the lines that really stood out to us. I mean, I could go on all night about the really kind of resonant phrases that are just scattered throughout your book, but perhaps one that's relevant. You talk about hope rather than optimism, and I feel that there's grounds for hope. I feel that the grounds for hope lies in the fact that the story that we're telling hasn't yet been finished, that there is still time to determine what story we tell. But where do you find reason to hope that we can learn to become good ancestors?
You know, that I think the place I find hope, in fact, I found hope in an obscure little paragraph of a book called Energy in the English Industrial Revolution, written by Tony Wrigley, a demographic historian. And in that book, he is discussing how in the 18th century, great kind of luminaries and major thinkers like Adam Smith didn't even know there was an industrial revolution going on right under their noses. They couldn't see in a way that they were part of a huge epochal shift from feudalism to industrial civilization. Now, out of that, I get enormous hope rather than optimism, because I think we might not be, but we might be in one of those shifts ourselves, getting off that civilizational plane of decline to a different kind of way of being. Now, where do we find it? Well, we see it in pockets. We see it all around the place. We see it in Extinction Rebellion, the Sunrise Movement, and Fridays for Futures. You know, social movements campaigning for planetary care and justice, and justice for future generations. In the US, there's an amazing organization called Our Children's Trust, a public interest law firm that is campaigning for the legal right to a safe climate and healthy atmosphere for both current and future generations. Now, they are in a David versus Goliath struggle against the federal government. They filed this major lawsuits and at the state level. But this is one of the most important shifts in the history of rights since the French Revolution, the idea of giving rights to people who may not be born for decades. It's amazing. So I look at all those examples. I look at, you know, regenerative economic organizations, you know, the rise of the B Corp movement, triple bottom line accounting, all these things, and you put it together. And I think there may well be a kind of a pattern of change, but it is a kind of palimpsest, to borrow one of your words there, that, you know, we can still easily turn to, you know, ExxonMobil or giant tech companies and think this world ain't going to change. But, you know, I do see that there is a possibility for kind of hope. But I wonder if some of the hope might lie not so much in thinking about time as thinking about place. Because one of the things I really felt with your book was the way you kind of wove these two things together. I think there's been a lot of writing about place in the last, say, 20 years or so. And it felt to me like one of the great innovations of your book is that you were able to sort of take that kind of way of thinking or analyzing or repositioning ourselves, not just in terms of place, but time, but showing how they work together. So can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, well, I guess, you know, the challenge, as we've been saying, is to make a sense of deep time, which seems very distant, you know, far beyond the scale of human experience, tangible. And so, you know, thinking about, you know, places, textures, landscapes, topographies, is a way to perhaps make that more readily available, to think about these places as also engaged in the great flow of deep time. And yeah, and it's perhaps also, you know, worth bearing in mind that, you know, the kind of temporal crises that we're facing aren't being experienced evenly, and that places around the world are finding a very different kind of Anthropocene sort of hurtling down the barrel towards them. For some of us, it is it's a much easier ride at the moment than it is for others. And I think, you know, thinking about the kind of the varied experience of climate change, of the climate crisis around the world, is an important part of addressing the challenge of thinking with deep time. I'm aware that we did say that we wouldn't hog the whole evening, and we would allow people to have questions. So maybe if I could just ask one last question of you, and then maybe we'll kind of move on. You talked about all the little things going on, and you know, with the seemingly small actions and activism that might build into the larger picture. The thing that's perhaps stayed with me the most in the book is your recommendation that we all start writing the date differently, that you put a 0 in front of the year. So instead of 2020, a 0 2020, and already you're thinking in terms of thousands of years. And it really has completely changed my perspective doing that. So, and that's just one example of the things we could do. If there was one thing that you would like everyone to do to be, you know, to get on that road to becoming a better ancestor, what would you say it should be?
Well, just to say, the thing about putting the 0 in front of the date is, I mean, I love that too, and that's something that I got from the Long Now Foundation, where they do that, and I think it's fantastic. If there was one thing to do now, I mean, since we are just around the time of a US general election, I would say this: give your kids your vote if you have children, or give your votes to your grandchildren or to a young person if you know them. Let me tell you why, or let me tell you how. In the late 2019, at the time of the last UK general election, my partner and I decided to give our kids an unusual birthday present. We gave them our votes. So we sat around the kitchen table, and our 11-year-olds debated the party manifestos with us, and we discussed the electoral system, and they then told us where to put the X on the ballot sheet. And in case you're wondering, no, they didn't simply follow and copy their parents' political opinions. There were a few differences there, but we did it because we know that future generations are being disenfranchised. You know, our actions will impact their lives, like maybe at no point in human history. So with an election coming up, be bold, give the kids your vote, pass it forward. I think that might be one route to go. It might take courage, but you can try it out. But I think at that point, we should be switching back over to Kate, who will adjudicate the questions. And we really, David and I really encourage you all to please pop some questions in the Q&A and share your thoughts and ask us anything you like, more or less.
Wonderful. Okay. Your first question you've received is a hard one, so get ready. So Scott says, the human animal never ceases striving for something better, but animals make no such effort. Unless hungry or in danger, animals pass their days in tranquility. Does this get to the heart of our problem? In other words, is consciousness overrated?
Do you want to go first, David, or shall I?
You're the philosopher.
I don't know. Am I the philosopher? Well, I tell you what that makes me think about. I mean, firstly, it reminds me of a quote from Nietzsche, which is, he who has a why to live for can bear with almost any how. That idea that humans, for meaning and purpose, need a goal, something bigger than themselves to drive them, to get them out of bed at the morning. It could be finding a cure for cancer if you're a scientist, or keeping your family business alive. But whole species need that too. I mean, Carl Sagan wrote about the importance of having a telos for our species, the ancient Greek word for a kind of a goal or objective. The question is, what should our telos be? You know, I think the de facto telos or goal, you know, for Western civilization, at least since the end of the Second World War, was GDP growth, material improvement, going up and up that curve. Whether it's a neoliberal government or Keynesian or Marxist, everyone thought the same thing, a bit of a consensus. And I think we need to shift off that now that we're in the Anthropocene. We need to learn to thrive in balance within planetary boundaries. We can't just cross our fingers like Steven Pinker and hope that we can keep growing and growing and growing. Even my kids, when they were 4 years old, knew that you couldn't keep blowing up a balloon with the prospect that it would never pop. Of course it pops at some point. Now, if we were a bit more like animals that probably are not so obsessed with climbing growth curves and things like that, maybe we would be better off. But we have to also recognize that that capacity to think long is something which could eventually help us. The fact that I can imagine my kids, I just mentioned my 11-year-old twins, I can imagine my son or daughter when they're 90 years old. I can imagine them holding their own great-grandchild who could live well into the end of the 22nd century. Their future isn't science fiction. It's an intimate family fact, and it's just a couple of steps away from my own. And if I don't want them to if I want them to look back on us as good ancestors, I need to use that imaginative capacity to think long term. David, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, absolutely. And, you know, the problem, I guess, that Scott's talking to there is that kind of restlessness. But we just have to, you know, see that as an advantage, as you say, and we turn that restlessness towards reimagining how things could be, you know, and asking ourselves the question, what do we really value? You know, what ought to be our goal? What are we looking to preserve and to carry forwards into the deep future, you know, for future generations, and what might we need to let go? You know, what you know, what's the aspect of the system that's dying that we need to allow to die, and what do we need to kind of put life into?
All right, we have another question from Cynthia, who asks, to think about the deep future is to think empathetically. How do we develop our capacity for empathy, and what stories will help us grow in that way? So 2 parts.
Do you want to start with this, David?
Yeah, well, I mean, I teach literature for a living, and so I'm going to stick up for literature and poetry. I think there's a great deal to be said for reading poetry to encourage that kind of elasticity, that empathetic elasticity, and a temporal elasticity as well. I think, you know, a poem is an art form that has an extraordinary capacity to draw many different times and timescales into its orbit. You can find in the shortest piece of poetry, the shortest lyric, vastly different timescales and speeds and experiences of time get drawn into a single space, a single moment of perception that we then enter into as the reader and sharing as if it was our own moment of perception, our own complex knot of different times woven together. And so I think that we could do a lot worse in cultivating and kind of exercising that empathetic muscle than you know, looking to the arts, looking to literature, looking to poetry to kind of exercise our imaginations in that way.
I love that. That was a beautiful defense of poetry. So my thought on this is, well, I've written a book about empathy, and I also founded something called the Empathy Museum, which is a international traveling art project, which is all about the art of stepping into the shoes of other people. And one of our exhibits is called A Mile in My Shoes. It's a gigantic shoebox, which has been to Russia and Brazil, and it's been to Seattle and all over the place. And you can walk inside. It's the world's first empathy shoe shop. And you can literally wear the shoes of a stranger, someone who's been in prison for 14 years, a Brazilian sex worker, a Syrian refugee, and literally walk a mile in their actual shoes while listening to an audio narrative of them talking about their own life in their own words. Now that's about connecting with people in today's world, connection empathically across space. How do we do that through time when we cannot put on the shoes of people from the year 2100? We cannot look them in the eye or have conversations with them. And I've been racking my brains about how to kind of create an artwork actually and work with the Empathy Museum on, and if anybody in the chat can, or the Q&A can write in their ideas for how you would create a work of art which really connects us with future generations. Maybe poetry actually is the secret way, and all sorts of literary forms and films and other ways of doing it. I think the problem with, of course, a lot of film, you know, Hollywood style, is it's very voyeuristic, you know, when it doesn't embody a lot of ambiguity like the poetic kind of voice. But I also think we can learn a lot from indigenous cultures, you know, from the idea of 7th generation decision-making, which can be found in, you know, many Native American communities, Iroquois culture, Lakota peoples, and also in Indonesia in the Moluccas Islands, they do 7th generation decision-making too. And we can take that idea and bring it into our own world. So for example, in Japan, there's this amazing movement called future design. And what they do is it's directly inspired by the Iroquois idea of 7th generation decision-making. And what they do is they have a program for local government citizen long-term decision-making. They invite local citizens to discuss and draw up plans for the towns and cities where they live, but they split them into 2 groups. Half of them are told they're residents from the present day, and the other half are told to imagine themselves as residents from 2060. And they're even given these like ceremonial kind of orange robes to wear, almost kimonos, to help them in their imaginative journey. Turns out the residents from 2060 come up with far more radical plans for their cities, whether it's healthcare investment or climate change action. So I think those imaginative journeys are part of the way that we start making that empathic leap across time.
It's fascinating. Okay, so we have some related questions here. This one is related, but maybe with a different spin. It's in a time when people are struggling with so many urgent personal issues, how do you convince them to make changes that need to be made now in order to be good ancestors?
I'll say something about that. Well, I'm sure Roman has many thoughts as well. And the example of the Great Stink that you gave is I think a good one. That that was a crisis. Admittedly, not a crisis on the scale that we're facing now, but nonetheless, something that urgently needed to be dealt with. And so addressing the needs of the present was not incompatible with addressing the needs of the future. In fact, I think we need to perhaps embrace that idea that if we're really going to invest in making the world better for the people who are going to sort of take it on after us, the people who will inherit it after us, we will make it better for ourselves now. I mean, there's no great distinction between creating a world for others to thrive in and one for ourselves to thrive in, I think, as well. So not seeing that as incompatible, I think, surely is a start, and perhaps seeing, as we hear many times, these crises as opportunities to do better for more people, to draw more people into that experience of living well. So many people are finding that they can't live well, or the way that they want to live well is blocked off, and in really making the world safe to inherit for future generations means making it livable for everyone. But Roman, I'm sure you've...
Well, actually, as you're talking, I was remembering this quote from Groucho Marx, where he allegedly said, "Why should I care about future generations? What have they ever done for me?" And I think intuitively, a lot of people feel that, and in many ways, rightly so, in the sense that people are dealing with their current problems, whether it's the crisis of COVID, dealing with problems in your family and family deaths, in your business, or governments have this as well, but also, the immediate needs of the world's 220 million refugees, who will be 400 million by 2050. There's a real need to address the crises of the present. But as David says, I think there is a kind of an intersection here. I remember speaking not long ago with someone called Sophie Howe, who is the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. It's a public position that specifically designed to focus on, and her job is to look at the impact of legislation, say 30 years ahead, environmental policy, economic policy, and transport, and so on. And in fact, that idea of a Future Generations Commissioner is spreading around the world. There's a campaign for the whole UK to have a Future Generations Commissioner now. The Netherlands is picking up on this idea. Finland already has a parliamentary committee for the future. But what Sophie Howe said to me, she said, well, look, I focus on, this is her speaking, those kinds of issues which benefit both current and future generations. Renewable energy, for example, pollution in the air, all these kinds of things are about well-being today and well-being tomorrow. And you see countries like Norway, for example, putting enormous investment into their healthcare systems and education systems. It helps children today, but it's also intergenerational. It's trying to deal with intergenerational inequality and things like that. So I think that we need to try and, definitely, at least part of the, let's say, in most crass terms, the sales pitch to politicians is to say this long-term thinking can be done to help people today and people will vote for it. But I also believe we have to make that connection through time. And that Japan example I gave, future design, there are towns that have voted to increase their taxes today to invest in long-term water infrastructure to help their children and grandchildren's water supplies. So people also need, I think, at some level to make sacrifices, but they don't need to be defined that way. It's part of intergenerational gifting, let's say.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left in the event. So just a reminder to anyone in the audience, if you would like to ask a last-minute question before we wrap up, now is your time. We have a question from an anonymous attendee who says, what elements of our society, aside from environmental policy, which this event has focused on, could benefit from thinking about deep time?
Should I just say something briefly about that? So next week, I'm going to a meeting with British government officials to discuss synthetic biology, engineered biology, and there's a whole realm of technology issues which are very much about the long term. Some of them have environmental impacts or not. So synthetic biology, there's the idea of, well, should we be creating artificial foods? Will we need to create, artificial organisms to feed 10 billion people in the next 100 years? But there's also questions about, are we going to make synthetic human beings? And what are the moral implications of that when we basically invent the world of Blade Runner 2049 or Blade Runner 1 as well? So, and then of course there's artificial intelligence has got all these long-term issues built into it. And then there's, the whole thing about space travel. Should we be going to Mars? There's another long-term issue. Carl Sagan, the astronomer mentioned earlier, he said that, well, if we're going to survive for the long term, we've got to people other planets. We've got to spread the risk because we might blow ourselves up on this one. Now, personally, I think we need to, before we go to Mars, we need to learn to live within the boundaries of this one planet we know that sustains life. Once we've learned to do that, fine, go to Mars as much as we like. But we haven't yet learned to live within those ecological boundaries. And you very much get that feel when you read David's book and his explorations of the coral bleaching on the barrier reef in Australia, what's happening to the ice in Antarctica and so on, really goes deep into you. And I don't go into these things so much in my book, and that's why David's book's really important, I think, for giving a sense of the feeling of that future being written on our skin and in our history. But some of these things are ecological, but some of them technological too.
Yeah, and I just thank you for that. But I would just add, that the pandemic, of course, is perhaps also something that we know has come from an excessive short-term thinking in terms of how we allow zoonotic diseases to spread and a lack of preparedness. But the COVID-19 pandemic has its own deep time dimension as well, in terms of the massive increase in single-use plastic, which is now, circulating and contributing to the problem of plastic pollution, perhaps even potentially forming a kind of pandemic layer. So these other kind of crises of short-termism have their deep time dimensions. We need to, adopt, as Roman says, the benefits of long-term thinking, so that we learn to anticipate, we learn to prepare, and we live more successfully, more healthily in the world that we're making.
So here's a personal question for both of you, which is, when did you as individuals start wrestling with the idea of deep time? And how did that influence or impact your personal life and goals?
Yeah, for me, it was probably about 6 or 7 years ago, and it was simply through reading, which I do a lot of in my line of work, and coming across this strange term, the Anthropocene. And what does this mean? It was just beginning to circulate around that time, and the challenge that was to my imagination to think that humans might have a kind of planetary force and a geological legacy. And of course, there are lots of debates about the fitness of the term Anthropocene, about the rightness of using a homogenized we to talk about humanity and culpability and responsibility. But it was that simple provocation to think about our relationship with deep time. And that has led to I think for me, a profound change in perspective. I find it very difficult in a way not to think about the deep time consequences of the most banal everyday action. It's something I feel that I carry with me every day, to be quite honest. But as Roman says, we need not think about this as a kind of burden. It's about I really like that idea of thinking about what might look like a sacrifice as intergenerational gifting, and there's a gift that comes with this kind of perspective, because it's opening you up to future generations, I think.
Yeah, and for me, actually, interestingly, the Anthropocene wasn't my sort of trigger point, but it is something that has sort of slowly gone into my bones. But for me, the turning point really was a kind of revelation I had, a very shocking one I found in retrospect, which is that it was about 5 or 6 years ago as well, where I was I suddenly realized I used to be a political scientist, an academic, and I was apparently an expert on democracy. So I thought. But a few years ago, I suddenly realized that during those 10 years when I was teaching political science and stuff, it never once occurred to me that we disenfranchise future generations, that they have no political voice or representation. In a similar way, maybe in different ways, the way that, you know, slaves or women have been systematically disenfranchised through history, and they still are in many ways, but also those future generations haven't been brought into the political conversation. And I suddenly thought, how could I never have thought about that? It's sort of so obvious. Now, I think I probably only really thought about that because of people who were engaged in the Anthropocene and adopting that kind of language, getting us to start think longer term. Even climate scientists, you know, putting forward projections for sea level rises or CO2 in the atmosphere going 100 years, even 500 years ahead in some of the IPCC reports. So I think our imaginations have been stretching out, and maybe that's what helped me ask that question. But I recognized there was a core injustice in the way we think about democracy. You know, that there are these billions upon billions of people who are not involved, you know, and what are we going to do about that? You know, how are we going to give them a voice? That to me is the great question of 21st century politics.
I love that as an ending note, given that the election here is in 7 days. But if you two have more you want to add before we finish up, I think that is a beautiful place to stop for the evening, as we're almost out of time.
Well, I'd just like to add, please buy David's book, Footprints. I've only got the UK edition here, but there's the US one as well. But it is absolutely beautiful. There've been, you know, several books written on deep time over the last 20, 30 years. And this is, to me, the one that goes bang into my heart and expands my mind. So I hugely recommend it.
You're very kind. Well, I'll reciprocate. I'll just flash briefly the US cover because it looks quite different. There you go. That's what you'd be looking for. But please also do buy Roman's book, which is out in the US. This is the British cover, but it's pretty much identical. It's out in the US.
There's the US one.
There you go. On election day. So yeah, if on November the 3rd you want a shift in perspective, to shift gear into thinking about the long term, I can't recommend anything more highly or more enthusiastically than the Good Ancestor.
Well, there we go, a mutual appreciation society, and let's appreciate the audience as well. Thank you everyone for listening, for all your questions. Thank you, Kate, as well.
Thank you, Kate.
And more thank yous to the two of you tremendously for this moving conversation, which honestly, at least for me, has been a breath of fresh air in this year 2020 that's been so dominated by short-term thinking. Thank you to everyone for spending this evening with us, and please feel free to learn more about these important books at the links that I've provided in the chat. So on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a good night, keep reading, and please be well. Thank you.